Do you need me to share my screen, or are you okay following on your own screen the tutorial outline? In the other ones, they wanted me to share my screen, but I'm easy either way.
Was that the slides? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah. Shall I share my screen?
Yeah, share your screen.
All
That's
right,
lovely.
okay.
Thank you.
All right, no worries. There it is. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I've done that bit. Okay, so essentially, you've got 4 500-word short essays, for want of a better phrase. And the whole lot put together is 2,000 words. You've got plus or minus 10%, and that number doesn't include the references. The references are on top of that. Now that means you know each 500 word could be 450 or 550, and you're aiming for 2,000 in total. Okay, and important also to see these as essay-style responses, not as bullet point type responses or any other summarizing things. You've got to write it in a prose style, in full essay style. And it's also very important that you use correct APA style referencing as well. All right, so those are important issues. Now have a look at these, read these over if you haven't already managed to read them. And if there are any questions afterwards, I'll give you a few minutes to read them, then we can discuss them before we move on.
I probably only struggle with the third one. I read it and it's like I'm reading another language.
Okay, we'll come back to the third one in a second, then make sure that we get a bit more information there. All right, anybody got any other questions? If not, we'll move to question 3. So question 3, there is more likely to be a causal relationship between the variables investigated in a quasi-experimental design than a correlational design. Yes, no, maybe. So the first thing you've got to do, obviously, is work out what that question's actually asking you to do, and that's part of the, without giving it too much away, that is actually part of the challenge of writing one of these things. But if you think carefully what it's asking you, there's more likely to be a causal relationship between the variables investigated in a quasi-experimental design than a correlational design. So first thing it's asking you, you've got to ask yourself, what do you mean by causal relationship? X causes Y. Does that make sense? Or if I do this to this group of people, then that's going to happen. So then you've got to think to yourself, well, okay, that's what a causal relationship means. And is that more likely to happen in a quasi-experimental design or in a correlational design? Those are the two designs. So then you've got to think to yourself, what does quasi-experimental design mean? What does a correlational design mean? And which one of those is more likely to be able to tell me whether if I, if I give this intervention, then I'm going to reduce anxiety or whatever it might be. If I do X, then Y is going to happen. Which one of those is more likely to happen? And then you've got to argue your case. Does that make sense? Yeah? Excellent. Okay. Any other questions on those? All right, good. So what we're asking you to do is make sure you put a word count at the end of each of your answers. As I said earlier on, it won't be 500 words exactly per essay, more than likely, but you've got between 450-ish and 550-ish per short essay. Must use correct APA style. Now that is not just referencing style, but also the way we write. And APA is very much asking for active voice and things like that, and we'll look at those in a little bit deeper. Now I clicked on this owl.english Purdue thing earlier on for the last group, and they said they can't see it, so I won't click on it now. But if you click on that in your when you look in your tutorial slides, then that'll take you to a website which tells you all about how, the APA style and how to utilize it and how to do it effectively and things like that, okay? So it's worthwhile having a look at. Now, first thing to realize is that whilst we're not covering a traditional essay, as in it's not extended, etc., it's only short, but we do need responses in traditional essay style. So we do need you to write as if it's a full essay, and we need you to to demonstrate your argument and so forth and so forth. But it's also important that in order to create the argument and make your point, that you might need to challenge opposing ideas too. And you've only got 500 words to do this in, so any wasted words is going to be, taken away. If you've got 100 wasted words in your 500 essay, then that's 20% of your word usage. So theoretically, that could be the same as saying, well, you're only going to the highest mark you'll ever get is 80%. So think carefully about the words you use and how you do it. And like any essay, you must have an introduction and a conclusion. That might just be a sentence at the beginning that says, what I'm going to tell you is, and one at the back that says, because of this and this evidence, my argument has been, and so forth. So, but make sure you do introduce and you do conclude. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Body is tell them, and the conclusion is tell them what you've told them. Does that make sense?
Eric, with referencing, are we referencing after each essay, or do we reference it all at the end?
I don't mind, and the reason I say that is because if you're an EndNote user, then you won't have a choice. It'll all jump at the very bottom whether you like it or not. But if you're doing it by hand, you could put them after each essay. It doesn't matter as long as they're references, and as long as if you've referred to something in the text, you've done it correctly, and you've got it in the reference list at the end. Make sure it's not a big bibliography, as in if there's anything in the list at the end that hasn't been utilized, then it shouldn't be in that list in the end. Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, good. Any other questions? All right. So things to think about in terms of understanding whether you're doing okay. Making sure that what you're doing is relevant to the topic. It's very easy to jump on the first couple of things you've read and think, oh, I'll use them, and then you're going to try and somehow fit that material into into responding to your argument, and it doesn't work so well in the end. It's very clear when that happens when you're reading it. So you might actually end up having to read 20 or so articles in order to get the 5 that you want to use. But it is important that you make sure everything in there is directly relevant to your answer. Also very important that the way you've organized it, the way it flows, the way it's structured, the effectiveness of the argument, etc., is very, very clear. Now, on the surface, that sounds as if you're going to create this sort of, very structured one-size-fits-all, everybody's going to do the same thing. That's not what we want at all, but there are principles that you need to follow to do this well. But in fact, originality and insight is probably the things that differentiate very good from good. So that means that you're able to, that your essay, the way you structured, the way you put it down, the way you create your argument has been insightful in this, beyond the normal. So that's absolutely what we're looking for, but you have to do that within those basic principles. Make sure that your supporting materials are that you do support your arguments and that they're referenced, and that you have the way you use words and sentences and so forth, that it's very clear and accurate. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge in terms of using the words in a manner that, especially in a 500-word essay, in a manner that sort of says what you're trying to say, and you don't have any wasted words to utilize, or wasted words that have that have meant you've gone off track or something like that. Or, as I said earlier on, 100 words not required in a 500-word essay is 20% of your space. APA not only has guidelines for how to reference in the essay and how to structure your references in the list, but it also has guidelines on how to write. for sake of example, APA is very keen on the active voice. So it's worth your while getting a bit of your head around the APA style of writing too, because you will be using that now over the next few years. And of course, all that, make sure you understand the marking criteria, because without that, you could be doing all sorts of things. So you've got to really check what the marking criteria is looking for. And that's on the Moodle website. So, first thing to do, make sure you analyze effectively what it's asking you to do. Don't just jump straight into it. We've got a little bit of an exercise later on, which we'll have a look at that. Break it down, work out what it's asking you to do, and then think about how you're going to structure that, what you're going to do to make sure it flows effectively. You might need to do some comparisons, compares and contrasts. You've got to clearly look at similarities and differences, and making sure that you're not just putting your argument across, but you're also demonstrating the weaknesses on the other side of the coin as well. And then you need to make sure you've got detail in there, what the implications of what might be, and examples. Those are all the things that you need to bring in those 500-word essays. So it's quite a lot to bring in, which is why the way you structure them and write them is going to be very, very important. Is that okay? Yep, no questions? Good.
Eric?
Yeah.
Quick question. Question. What level of knowledge should we assume the reader has of the material? So, for example, if we take the last essay topic about deception, should we describe and define what deception is? Or is it assumed that the reader knows that material and we can go on to the other components of the essay?
I would, well, there's two things to that. You can assume the reader knows, but the reader doesn't know that you know. Does that make sense? So you'll need to have enough information in there to make it very obvious for the marker, i.e. me, to know that you actually know what it is you're talking about. So you don't need so much in there that you have to kind of really define it to the nitty-gritty, but it needs to be very clear somehow. It needs to, that you've worded it and structured it in a way that it needs to be very clear from when I'm looking at it that you clearly know what it is you're talking about. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yep, good, okay. So once you've got that, make sure, and this is sometimes much easier to say than do, that progression, that logical flow is there, because that's often the sign, believe it or not, of trying to do something last minute and not really doing a good job of it. What I always suggest is that you actually need to finish these things at least a week before you hand it in. So don't you do the hand-in time as your cut-off time. The cut-off time needs to be a week before that. And the reason that's very, very important is because that gives you a week then to edit. If you finish a week beforehand, leave it for a couple of days, then come back to look at what you've done, you'll be surprised as you look through it. When you look at it, you think, oh, okay, yes, there's lots more work I can do with that. Then if you leave a week, you can probably do that 2 or 3 times, which means each time you do it, you're tightening, you're making it sort of clearer, you're getting rid of more words, and you're making much more sense too. And importantly, that's also the time when you realize whether or not that flow is really working well. Even though, I mean, I've written and published over 100, I don't know, 100 something, whatever it might be at the moment, and I still do that. I still find it challenging, and I still find that the biggest hurdle is making sure that story, that flow is there. So you only got 500 words to do that, so it's not a big issue. It's not a 10,000 word or a 90,000 word or something like that, but it's still something that you need to work on, and it's not something to take lightly. When you're looking at paragraphs, it's another thing that often people go wrong is how they start paragraphs. Try and avoid some of these terms there. They don't work as well as they think they do, and also it's a wasted word. If you don't need these words, don't use them. I see that a lot, and I see also And you really just literally do not need that word for some reason. Somebody thinks it's important to put in there. So think carefully how you utilize them. And we're going to go into this a little bit more, but the detail is important. You've got to get the hang of that concise writing. Make sure you don't assume logical steps, and in fact, they're not there at all. And that also, you'll pick them up a lot more when you edit. And I see lots of this, which are often used. Therefore, you know, that paper says this paper says, therefore, this is the conclusion, when there's no connection whatsoever. So you just be careful about that. Careful of overgeneralizations, and make sure that the aim is to support your ideas with evidence, not assumptions. So assumptions are not what we're looking for. Even though it kind of sounds like we're looking for your opinion, we're not. We're looking for an argument that is based on evidence. Okay? And you'll be able to make that argument based on the readings you do, rather than, that might interestingly support your opinions, but the bottom line is the argument needs to be made from fact, or from what you read. Whoops. This is what I said earlier on. Give yourself time to edit. It makes a major difference when you give yourself time to edit. I know it's not always possible. Work gets in the way, life gets in the way, but if you can plan to give yourself a week, it's worthwhile. Apparently these don't work when I link into them, so I'm not going to link into them now. You can look at them yourself, but there's links there. You can't see it when I go into them. You just see the screen. So I'm talking away, jabbering about this lovely thing that I'm clicking on, and you can't see it, so I won't do it. But if you go into, there's lots of learning support that help you with these things. One of this is the ACAP learning support, and the link is up there on your tutorials. The other one is this Facebook site. Again, lots of materials in there, how to proofread, all sorts of things. Worth flicking through these things if you haven't already. And giving them a look. Okay, a bit of a challenge for you. One of the things also to get your head around is you've chosen psychology, or to do a psychology degree. And assuming you're going to use this degree in later life, the chances are that a lot of what you'll be doing and the way you're communicating is going to be on the written word. The written word was very, very important, and even if you're a psychologist, it's amazing how much psychologists use the written word. So from a professional perspective, making sure your punctuation, etc., is correct is absolutely vital. So have a look at this top paragraph, see what you think you might use where, and we'll come back to you in a minute and see how you do compared to our example. All done? All right, I won't embarrass you by, unless you particularly want to volunteer where you might put. Otherwise, you can do this as your own personal satisfaction. Did you get it? Did you get there? Yeah. Good. Well, I think the full stop was pretty obvious given the capital A, but anyway. These are relatively straightforward ones. The ones that, you know, little things that people often miss are things like the apostrophe, especially when it's an apostrophe S and things like that. So it's use this opportunity. Writing is a skill, like any other skill, it's hard work. And some people find it easier than others to develop because of whatever reason. But it's something that you do need to develop, and you do need to come better at, especially by the time you finish this, if you're going to work in any psychologically oriented career. It's surprising how much writing that we end up doing. Even as a, you know, even as a, not necessarily as an academic, even as a practicing psychologist or using psychology in other contexts. Good. So, any questions so far? All right, try and be specific and to the point. And that's, again, easier said than done. It sounds like, but if you look at this example here, you could argue, you know, from the one, you say, well, that is quite specific. A child's brain is nearly as big as an adult's, but actually you can be more specific and more factual with your response to it. And so think carefully about how you write, and in fact, you might even use less words by being more specific too. So it's important to think about that. And be very careful when you're utilizing words, you know, that men, girls, women, etc. And how you utilize them, because if you're not careful, it can come across as prejudiced, exclusive, etc. So think carefully about those. Science, I mean, I'm okay with science using first person. I often use first person in my writing. However, it's really good practice, especially at the stage you're at, to get the hang of using third person, because it does come across as more professional, although there's massive arguments as whether that's really whether it makes much of a difference. You might read a lot that's actually in first person, but it's important to get, it's actually a little bit harder as well in some cases, but it's important to get the hang of writing in third person, and also in active voice. APA is very keen, as I said earlier on, for people to use the active voice. Be careful of using words like always, never, very, really, because they really always, never actually mean what they say, and they can be big jumps. So just be very careful how you use words. Trying to be fact-driven rather than opinion-driven. So make sure you support what you're doing and reference effectively. Okay. Any questions so far? Everything okay? Good. When you're using material, other people's material and reference, it's sometimes very easy just to say, well, the first few that I read, I will utilize. But that might be a little bit of putting a square peg in a round hole. So you might end up having to read 15, 20 little bits, or at least briefly read them in order to find the 3 or 4 or 5 that you want to utilize. So it's important to make sure that the material you used is relevant to the question, and also that you use it effectively. So here's an example underneath there, and it's also done in the active voice. Jones and Mitchie, 2005, because that's how they ask you to do it, scanned 2,000 children and found that the average child's brain at the age of 5 years was approximately 90% of the volume of an average adult brain. Okay, so that's just an example of how you can be specific in active voice, etc., etc. Here's another example of the argument you're going to make. Were the experiments on social conformity ethical in the 1950s? Let's say you're going to say yes. Investigating social conformity were deemed ethical in the year in which they were conducted. The following reasons substantiate this claim, as an example of how to get in there quickly and to do that. So we don't have time for you to do this with another activity I'm going to ask you to do in a minute. We don't have to do that. But if thinking about this broadly, make sure that your response stays on topic and doesn't veer off topic, and you know that you want to make sure the material is very relevant. And it's easy to try and fit something into the answer when it doesn't quite fit, and it's very clear when you read it that that's what's been done. So be careful. And as I was saying before, you know, if you've got 100 wasted words in your 500-word essay, that's 20% of your words gone, and that means you're basically giving yourself a maximum of 80%. So how you use the words, how you support it, all those sort of things is really, really important. But I will reiterate that this is not discouraging insight, creativity, independent thought. We really want that, and that's what differentiates good from very good. But there are principles that we need to follow that allow that to happen, as opposed to constrain it. Okay, so I'm going to put you into groups in a minute, and what I'm going to ask you to do is look at this. You might have to. You're not going to be able to see it on my screen anymore, so you have to get your own onto your own screen. But in your groups, what I want you to do is look at this. Imagine that's your question, and work on it and see if you can come up with the first sentence for this, and work out what it is that how you might approach this. And after you've done all that, if you've got time, what your first sentence might be. Now, what time is it? It's now 7 o'clock, so we might have time. It's coming up to 7. Is that okay? Any questions on that? So if I stop sharing now, come back. So I'm going to put you into groups, and when I do that, just come up with some kind of way of approaching that, and see if you can get to even write that first sentence. Okay? I'll come and say hello as once you're in all your groups. Okay, should be getting something now. Have you not got anywhere, Sarah? Okay. Hannah, are you there?